Hey, are you hiring? If you answered yes, let XenTegra Staffing help staff your IT people needs. Head over to XenTegra.com/XenTegra Staffing to find out more. XenTegra Staffing, we can staff your IT people needs. Welcome to another edition of the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton, your source for all things Citrix.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 55. Yeah, that's right, 55 episodes. I guess, Bill, maybe we'll get to 57 prior to the end of 2020, huh? Bill, I think you're the favorite words of 2020. Bill, I think you're on mute.
You're absolutely right. I was on mute.
I would almost say you did that on purpose, but I don't think people think we're that smart.
No. I was going to say, we'll probably end up 57. Yeah, probably 57, maybe 58 by the end of the year.
No, it's great. Yeah, I guess 2020 hadn't been a total loss.
No.
And that's not true. 2020 actually. Well, it's been a different kind of year. I guess we'll just leave it at that.
Very different.
Hey, you know what? I'm gonna say something to that comment real quick. You know, I've spent 20 years of my life. I don't want to say scaring people, but encouraging people to think about what if there was a pandemic? What if we couldn't go into offices? I guess from that perspective, 2020 might be the culmination of all those conversations, and maybe things for some organizations start to move in the direction that we've always thought they should have been moving.
Yeah, absolutely. I've used that example before, but never thought we'd actually be in one. You know, just like any other disaster type thing, you never think it's going to happen, and customers just need to be prepared for it. And some were, and some weren't. I think the lesson is that we need to take all these things we talk about from disaster and business continuity. We need to take them seriously and really properly plan for them.
You know, I've got a panel I'm on this afternoon, financial institutions talking about business continuity. And my thing is, don't plan for a pandemic. Plan for half your employees, needing a day or two or three a year to take care of their sick relative, or, maybe they need to work from home because the plumber's coming or something. You plan for that. These pandemic things will probably fall into place when the time comes. That's what I saw a lot of organizations thought ahead that way.
Or like things are here today, snow day.
Snow day. It's not even Christmas time yet.
I know. It's not much snow, so we get the day off anyways. But plus, they're all virtual schools, so it doesn't matter. But the point is, snow days do happen.
I thought about that the other day with my kids, and kids to come. There will probably be another snow day in schools, because they'll get the day off. They'll get the day from not going to school, but they'll probably still have some form of remote work. It'll never be quite the same.
Yeah, possibly. That's right.
Well, we're joined with Kevin Nardone from Citrix. Kevin, how's it going?
Going really well, Andy. Bill, I have to thank you. I think the on the mute joke came from the last session. I definitely borrowed that as an icebreaker as a quote for 2020 a couple times. So I appreciate that joke I could borrow for some calls, and glad to be on with you all again.
We brought that up on a team call the other day, and then we went out looking, and there's lots of T-shirts that have been made for you're on mute 2020 or something like that.
Yeah,
gotta get one of those. Well, Kevin.
Yeah. Sorry.
Kevin, your latest greatest title. I've known you for about 10 years now ish. Current title is what?
Yep, I am a senior enterprise architect with our customer success team. So I really focus on working with a bunch of members of our enterprise portfolio, really trying to help map business objectives, like Bill, like you talked about, like, hey, how do I do business continuity properly? Or I want to institute a work from home, aligning those with like the technical outcomes to make it a reality. So like, what's the order of operations I would need to accomplish to achieve that for my business? So like a lot of what I've been focusing on recently is really like getting organizations to the cloud, because especially with the influx of people having to work remotely, and then just the growth of virtualization at data center, a lot of organizations have been looking at cloud particularly Microsoft Azure, to kind of handle that influx and that need for like net new compute. But it's been fun. It's been a great, decade so far, and had a chance to work with a lot of different customers and get a lot of different perspective.
Yeah, Kevin, sometimes I'm envious of your job. It seems like a lot of fun. If you're a mechanic / engineer / consultant / tinkerer at heart, it seems like a great job to have.
It's a very nice way to say nerd, but yes, I'm definitely a nerd and tinkerer at heart myself. So it's fun.
Yeah, it's probably true. But hey, I relate, so that's okay.
Exactly. I think nerds are in 2020.
Ever since the first movie came out, there's something, and I'm really stretching here, but the nerd has found a new vernacular, I guess, maybe in modern day world. It's not what it used to be the nerd. It's Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Steve Wozniak. I can go on and on and on. Those Zuckerberg, those guys have made it cool to be the nerd. So let's just embrace it.
Exactly.
I would argue that Mark Templeton made it cool to be kind of nerdy and trendy all at the same time. All right. So this podcast we're covering today, this is part 2 of your series from Citrix Tips, which if people don't know what Citrix Tips are, it's a whole series of blogs that Citrix puts out, mostly from the consulting groups and the architect group, that really goes deep into some topics. And this is part 2 where we cover Citrix on Azure, Microsoft Azure, enterprise scale landing zones. So Kevin, you want to just give us a quick recap of what we covered in the part 1 blog and the part 1 podcast we did on that blog?
Yeah, definitely. So like thinking of, the cloud adoption framework, and it kind of like relates back to the, virtual desktop handbook of like Citrix Your, in terms of like really on the Microsoft side, outlining a methodology to get like a net new cloud environment up and running. How do you need to approach your business? Like what are the governance parameters you need to think of? What are the networking parameters, policy, how do you monitor it effectively? Kind of really walking through the build out process of like setting that and bringing it to reality. There's a section of the cloud adoption framework that really talks about bringing those concepts to enterprise scale. And if I have to kind of really summarize what enterprise scales means, it's thinking modularly. How can I set up a foundation that if my business needs change, I've set up a way that can grow in a structured way where I can like just add an additional module, a unit of scale, and then potentially accommodate, net new business needs within my organization. So in the first part, it was really walking through what are some of the design principles. So like, what are the thought processes that you really need to take to think about enterprise scale Azure? Now, if I had to really kind of summarize that in a single sentence, is you want to design for success, planning for success and planning for growth. You don't want to be in a scenario where, hey, we have 1,000 users today. This is all we're ever going to think about. You always want to ask yourself, like, what if we're successful and the business can pull more from this initiative? What if we need to grow? What if we need to change? What if there's a net new use case or like a net new business need that comes in? Have we set up our modules in a way that we can tack that on to grow accordingly? So like planning for growth is planning for success. You always want to come into a project with optimism, understanding that, hey, if we're successful here and we're asked by our leadership, like we got to do it again, let's make sure we don't design ourselves into a corner. But a lot of the part 1 was really focusing on the thought process and the methodology and the principles of the enterprise scale landing zone within Azure. And then thinking of like part 2 and the following parts, it really then gets more of a deep look into the critical design areas that make up an Azure design. So thinking of your Azure AD tenants, how are you going to do identity? What's the management group and subscription setup you're going to set up? Your network topology, your monitoring structure. How are you going to approach business continuity of Azure? So I know, like Bill, you were mentioning, business continuity within your data center, but even thinking cloud. And like as you start operationalizing cloud, you want to make sure you follow the best practices around continuity and disaster recovery for that vendor. So really kind of summarize what each design area is in the first part, at least at like a high level, give links to where to go, just to summarize, and then really focus on the first 3 around your Azure AD tenants, how, like in concepts of like dev and prod, identity and access management, what are your identity solution, like what's going to be the impact on Citrix. So really try to walk through each area and how, from a Citrix perspective, what are the things you need to think about as you go through that process.
I think you're, so let's jump through this. Well, first of all, let me ask this question. As it relates to getting it right, is it worse today to get it wrong in a cloud era where you're doing IaaS as a service and other various services than it was when you built it out in your own data center? Or is it more malleable and more adjustable today than it was in the past where you were building it out in your data center? Is it better? Is it worse to get it wrong up front or less worse to get it wrong up front in today's world?
So especially from an infrastructure standpoint, I think one of the best examples I've ever seen in terms of like how much more malleable this is was one of my customers like years ago. You're talking like 2017, 2016, where a lot of these concepts were fairly new. We were getting ready to kick off a pilot of setting up, Citrix within their Azure environment. They had 2 Azure regions that were up and running. Their team accidentally provisioned what we needed in the wrong region within their portfolio. And then like the week prior, they were saying like, hey, wait, we got to like set this all up in the other region. We're actually going to start there. And they effectively, like the same concept of like building a new data center, they did that like over a weekend before our team got started, just by going about, running a series of ARM templates and building out the components we needed to get started. They effectively lifted and shifted regions over a weekend, which when you think of like that concept, like a decade ago, everyone would have thought you were absolutely insane. So like in that regard, like infrastructure, like the way even like you approach scalability testing, thinking of a data center world, it'd be like, hey, do all this data up front. You got to rack and stack this hardware. You got to make this big capital expense. You need to get it right. Even the way I'd approach scalability testing, it's like, hey, let me take a look at what Citrix recommends, like of initial recommendations. Let's start there just to get going. And then if we need to adjust over time, we can do that because we have the flexibility. So like you don't have to let analysis paralysis of capacity stop you from moving forward. But to like kind of build off of what you mentioned, Andy, in terms of like what's harder to change, thinking around this first blog. So things around like how you do your Azure AD tenants, what are you doing from an identity and access management perspective? Like, did you set up your subscription governance appropriately within the organization? Setting up your process. And if you kind of don't do that correctly in a way where you're setting up every team within your organization to scale as a platform team, so like the team that owns your Azure, those challenges are much harder to change. Not to the same degree of like, hey, I didn't build a data center in the right place, but if you suddenly, are lumping your Citrix team into a subscription and like, hey, like we can't grow, and then you need to like redesign your network for like a net new like hub and spoke subscription architecture, that's going to take a little bit of time. So it's like the planning needs to get shifted to different areas. But what's great is like once you've kind of done that initial governance planning, it's kind of off to the races.
Yeah. So, but it sounds like from that, it's easier to lift and shift and revert now than it was, because you have elasticity, you have these templates you can use, you can script things. I mean, you can't just go physically build another data center on the other side of the country if you need to do overnight. But so it sounds better. It sounds better, but still very, very, very important to get as much as you can right, knowing that you're never going to get it all right up front.
Exactly. It's all about like the planning time is, I would say the planning time is you could work much more agilely, like where you're kind of doing small increments of planning and moving forward, and thinking though of like if I have to summarize the overall purpose of this series is like, hey, what are the things that you as a Citrix team or like you as a platform team who's like really trying to help your Citrix team set up for success? Like what are the key areas you need to think about where you're asking the right questions? So like, for example, hey, Azure team, like how are we setting up our Azure AD tenant setup from like a production and dev standpoint? Like, are we doing isolation there? Hey, Active Directory team, like what are we doing for identity in public cloud? Like how is that going to impact how we set up Citrix? So like really trying to empower, our Citrix champions, globally, like just to speak Azure and kind of really understand like what are the things they need to think about. So that way, when they're working with their platform team or working with XenTegra or like within their own teams, they know what to ask and they know what to look for.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounded like we covered a lot of that in part one, and then part two, we're talking about some of the key areas for design. And the first one you have here is enterprise enrollment with Azure AD tenants. Is that where we want to start with this blog?
Yep. Yeah, we can start there. And like thinking of and I think each one of these little design areas could probably have their own blog. But what I really want to try to focus on was like what's a recommendation that the cloud adoption framework has for that specific tenant, and really try to relate it to a Citrix concept. So for Azure AD and thinking of the concept of Citrix Cloud, where do we integrate with Azure AD directly as a technology? It could be end user authentication as well as administration authentication. Now, one of the recommendations from the cloud adoption framework is you don't want to just start creating new Azure AD tenants, like just where you have them all over your organization. Because like subscriptions, like the bucket, which we'll get into a little bit later, they can be mapped. You could have multiple subscriptions rolling into a single tenant, but a subscription can't be split between multiple Azure AD tenants. So it's kind of like a one-to-one. And like that design constraint on the Azure side also applies on the Citrix end. So we can only integrate like a Citrix Cloud tenant into a single Azure AD tenant. So like thinking of your lines of demarcation, for example, between prod and non-prod, you want to ensure that your Citrix Cloud accounts, like say, for example, if, hey, we're setting up, 500 users and we want to have like a dev test tenant on the Citrix side, because on our Azure AD side, we actually have that same level of isolation. If we're rolling out a new feature, a new capability, or like we want to be able to test something where like federating another identity provider to our Azure AD, so like using something like an Okta or a Ping, like you do a lot of that at the tenant level. So thinking of being able to roll those changes without impacting your masses, a lot of organizations look at similar levels of isolation. So at the Citrix side, we want to match that, because we're only able to plug into one Azure AD tenant as possible. So like thinking of like that bucket of Azure management, one-to-one on the Citrix side. I have a bucket of Azure management. I need to make sure I align that bucket to like my Citrix account setup.
And hey, Bill, let me pause here and let you jump in. Do you have comments or questions on that?
Well, I think the only thing that I would say is make sure that the listeners understand the tenant, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, the tenant is really like the top level management framework, or is there something above that?
There's something about, like, you can get into like accounts and like enterprise agreements, but I would say like mostly from a like admin side, it's pretty much like where the top level where you're working from an identity perspective. So think of it as like your Azure, your AD forest. Right. It's like the same concept as your AD forest. Yeah. And so thinking back to like on-prem. Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so thinking on-prem, like you can like, hey, I have one, this is my forest and I'm going to maybe set up other forests. Like on the Azure side, when it comes to that high level unit of management and governance, Citrix can plug into like each Citrix account can plug into one of those. But like thinking as well, again, with cloud technology, you're not spinning up like back-end servers and like databases to have additional units. So like additional, bringing it back to like the on-prem example, like Forest, for instance, you're kind of working with, Microsoft, or like working with our Citrix team and saying like, hey, I need to have 2 accounts or like 2 little bubbles of admin domain where I'm going to be working and kind of configuring my cloud infrastructure. I need 2 bubbles, one for prod, one for dev. And then you kind of make sure those align accordingly.
Right. I see. Yeah. I don't know that I could be wrong, but I don't know that we've run into customers with multiple tenants. We have run into many customers with multiple subscriptions under a single tenant.
Yes, that's the most common.
Subscription for, prod, server workloads, and maybe a subscription for just the Citrix components and so forth.
Yep. Yeah. And that's the most common. Single tenant infrastructure tends to be where most organizations land. You just kind of get into where you may run into like a multiple tenant setup is if like someone did like an acquisition and that organization already had some form of Azure setup, or you're running into a scenario where the customer has fully, from top down all the way to the bottom of the stack, like full isolation between their prod and dev, which at the Azure AD tenant level, that's not necessarily required. You could potentially do that within, like, say, your subscriptions. Because the one reason, again, like from Microsoft side, and like you got to have a really strong case and processes like around having multiple tenants, because that then funnels into how you're doing role-based access, how you're doing, domain federation. So it's not, like I'd say, it's by no means like very common. So it's more to kind of let, admins know if suddenly your Azure team is like kind of looking at potentially over engineering, like there needs to be like a real strong case, because like running multiple forests and you have to worry about all these domain trusts, running like a multiple Azure AD tenant infrastructure, it's going to add complexity that really needs to have the proper business justification behind it.
Understood. Yeah.
I heard a lot there, and it's definitely a different world. Kevin, what do you do for the average Citrix admin that has yet to truly get ramped up on Azure and the conversations around subscriptions and tenants and accounts? I mean, the account one's kind of easy, right? You have this account for your organization, and below that you have subscriptions and tenants. I guess it's not to be solved here. I guess what I would tell people is what we find is that the Citrix control plane, especially the cloud stuff, does a really good job of interacting with your tenant, and you're basically just plugging into it with your information and rolling from there, right? It does a good job of helping spin up what you need.
Yeah, and like the Citrix Cloud in the Azure context is seen as like an application. So like thinking of like your platform team, so like who owns the Azure within an organization, like Citrix, while we're delivering apps or like delivering desktops, and like the concept of like Azure design, we are like an application that sits upon that platform. But thinking of like Citrix admins and like learning the basics, Microsoft actually has a lot of great free training that cover some of these key concepts. Like, I mean, something you can probably maybe go through in like 4 to 5 hours of an e-learning course around like creating an enterprise scale architecture. I highly recommend, and you don't have to be an expert, and that there's like on the Citrix education side, we have like Citrix and Azure courses that cover some of the basics, but there's like so much free learning content out there that at least knowing like what some of these terms are, it's just going to help you be that much more effective during the design process. Because like it's now your hypervisor, it's now your data center. You do want to have at least some understanding of like the basics of how it runs, or at least what the concepts are.
And I would encourage people, if you don't know about Microsoft Channel 9, just Google that, or maybe if you're feeling very Microsoft friendly, Bing it. But there's a lot of really good videos and presentations out on Channel 9 that I pick up a lot from on the Microsoft side. Okay, your next section here, Kevin, talks about identity and access management and that being a critical design consideration. Do you want to walk us through what you have here?
Yep, definitely. This gets a little bit into like kind of a core prereq. Citrix today, especially when it comes to like the full virtual app and desktop service, we require like some form of directory. And like one of the more common misconceptions that customers tend to have, especially thinking of Azure, that like Azure AD in itself is like also a full directory service where I'm applying policies. I have things like Kerberos, and Azure AD is predominantly like an identity as a service for the most part. So, but like on the Citrix side, we still need some form of directory for functionality. So like the type of component that you integrate with on the Azure side is going to impact, what Citrix functionality is available. And this is mostly between like using like the full cloud service of like Azure AD directory services, which kind of domain service, which kind of covers like the things like policy, and like I have, what looks like a standard Active Directory domain. It kind of takes like the best of Azure AD where you have like an identity, and now my domain itself is also getting managed
Kevin,
with like a domain controller and things along those lines.
So you've got a graph here and a chart, and the first column is functionality. The second column is Azure AD. The third column is Azure AD DS, which I assume means directory services, and then full AD in Azure. If I have just Azure AD, there's lots of things on here that are checked and not checked. What's my biggest shortcoming if I just have Azure AD and I don't have a full Active Directory service to implement and integrate with and manage maybe the machine accounts? What's the biggest misnomer in just having Azure AD and implementing Citrix Virtual App and Desktop Service?
So the biggest thing is, you can, just with Azure AD only, the only thing you can really use is virtual app and desktop standard, which is like, you're pretty much like having your own isolated bubble of machines. And like thinking of like most organizations, especially when you look at cloud, I have applications, I have existing infrastructure, I have like an existing, some form of domain already. So like being able to like bring that environment in to kind of have that state where you're moving towards that cloud solution is like very, very challenging, because there's no way to relate what you're doing to current state. And like that typically tends to be where people look at like the full AD in Azure. And that's where I think 10 out of 10 deployments, I would say, like I haven't seen anyone use like just the cloud services. So like Azure AD or Azure AD DS, and meet all of their needs, at least within like an enterprise scale. Now, like as you kind of look towards like, smaller organizations, smaller IT shops, I might want to just run like a net new business, and I'm going to start like all cloud. That's a little bit different, but the biggest things is like the way you apply policies in an Azure AD only context. Like that whole framework is very much like not there.
So, Kevin,
being able to use like,
Kevin,
sorry, go for it.
Maybe it makes sense the difference between Azure AD and Azure AD DS. What's if you were just talking to someone, what would be the main thing you'd point out as being the difference between those two?
Azure AD is just an identity, whereas Azure AD DS is really like a true domain, like with policy control, like governance. Like that would be like the main, I'd say the primary difference.
So then the next thing you have here is full AD in Azure, and that's where you actually spin up Windows VMs in a normal Active Directory environment on VMs inside of Azure, right? Is that your third option here?
Yep. Yeah. So that would be like actually setting up infrastructure as a service, building domain controllers, going into like AD sites and services, and like extending your domain into Azure. Now the main difference, so you kind of said like, what's the main difference with Azure AD and Azure AD DS? Now, like what's the main difference between Azure AD DS and like a full AD domain? A lot of it sits around being able to extend your domain schema, as well as like managed certificate services. So like on the Citrix side, especially looking at capabilities like Citrix Federated Authentication Service, I want to translate a SAML assertion or FIDO token and like just something that's not normally just ingested by Windows for a password. I want to translate that into full single sign-on into my Windows workload. You need certificate services on the Citrix side, and being unable to like modify core templates or things along those lines in the cloud service, Azure AD DS eliminates the ability to use that capability compared to full AD. So like if your organization's looking at doing like full SSO from like an Okta or Ping and federating that out to Azure, like you won't be able to accomplish what you need from an SSO single sign-on standpoint.
So, Bill, where does Azure AD Connect kick into this? Is it part of number 1 and number 2, or
part of number 3? Generally speaking.
So in that case, we would have our AD on-prem, and we would have AD Connect, and that would connect to domain controllers in Azure versus just extending our domain into Azure.
What Azure AD Connect is essentially is enabling the account, the Azure AD account, to have some sort of awareness of the associated account in the customer's Active Directory. Is that correct, Kevin?
Yep. Yeah. Azure AD Connect, what it does is it replicates the objects from your, so like thinking of Azure AD, that's like an identity. Now users also going to have like a standard AD identity, like maybe I'm like authenticating into a legacy app, because Azure AD overall is an identity as a service. What Azure AD Connect does is it takes those users, those groups, those objects in your on-premise environment, and it synchronizes them to your Azure AD. Right, so like thinking of like how I want to authenticate maybe to Office 365 using the same like username and password I have.
So Kevin, if I could
synchronizes those objects.
If I could comment real quick, I think it's actually the opposite of what you said, Bill. I think Azure AD Connect allows you to synchronize that identity up into Azure AD or Azure AD DS. I think that's how you get those identities out to those cloud services, versus having full Azure AD, where you would just replicate as if it was part of your network, part of your AD environment.
Yeah, this is an area that I think a lot of customers get confused on, and we've had a couple of instances where the customer on their own, when they were setting everything up, and this goes back to your statement about proper planning, Kevin, they set up Azure ADDS, and then they wanted single sign-on from a Citrix application, which would require FAS, which you can't do with Azure ADDS, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So
and it would give you single sign-on. It gives you single sign-on for. Oh, sorry.
Go to full AD, right? It's very confusing, I think.
Yeah.
So Bill, tell the whole story, right? We were on a call. We were on a call Friday, Kevin, and we were trying to ask some of these questions and make sure that the customer understood what it was they were telling us they understood, and they literally hung up on us because they got mad at us for asking all these questions. But it's a very confusing space. Yeah, and customer just hung up on us because they just didn't want to explain to us so that we could understand what they knew or didn't know. It was an interesting Friday afternoon call.
So let me ask a question, because I would be one of these people that would get confused with the devil and the details on this. So let me take myself back a year ago. I'm managing an IT department. I got my daily duties that I'm dealing with, support, fires, yada, yada, yada. But I've got to approach an Azure project, and I want to do what Kevin's saying. I want to get out in front of this thing and make sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, because the other thing I'm thinking about this conversation is the cost that goes into this. And I'm sure we've all had customers that have crossed this bridge and they get on the other side and they go, wait a minute, the cost of this is not what I expected. So what would be some material that you could provide to some administrators to answer some of these questions, so that before you piss the customer off by asking all these things they don't know, you could say, hey, here's some documentation that we can provide you up front so that you understand the conversation that we're having.
Hey guys, I have a quick comment for Ben on this one. So Ben, I know your old environment, right? And I don't know if you were on when Kevin first started talking about this or not, but Kevin alluded to the fact that if you really want all that full integrated Citrix experience that you've known and loved, which your organization, which was running Citrix for over a decade or roughly a decade, was going to want and need, you're going to be in the far right-hand column, because the first two, they're not a true Active Directory with all the policy management and pieces. So I'll let Kevin obviously comment on this, but knowing your old environment and all the intricacies you guys had, you're going to need that third column in order to keep managing it the way you had been managing it.
Yeah, see, like what's interesting for me is Kevin talked about companies that are cloud-born. And some of those could go to Azure AD, but I see the big sticking point here is no domain. Can't do any domain joins, which is going to kill some of the authentication with some of the legacy apps. So this is all very interesting, but I kind of sit in the same boat as I get confused very quickly by some of the devil that are in the details here.
Yeah. Like Azure AD only would work if you were predominantly like 100% like web app infrastructure only, right? Because like thinking again of like taking Azure AD and bringing that concept to like how we integrate with it from like a Citrix cloud perspective is like Azure AD sees us as like an enterprise application within the app portfolio. We kind of do like a registration with our application to like being able to access the Azure Graph API, so like pull information. So like that's kind of where like if you're cloud only, like I'm web only, like which is like I would say very, very few organizations, you do need some form of domain service to like have the authentication with that like standard like thick apps. And like you're exactly right, Ben, like the devil's kind of in the details, especially around like Azure AD domain service. I mean, Azure, which is like kind of where you get domain controllers and they're managed by Azure. You kind of lose some of that like extensibility of that domain because it's fully controlled as a service, and there's got to be some sort of standardization. So like something like a domain, it's like kind of like the brain of your overall or heart of your overall environment in terms of like who's everybody, how are they getting in, how am I applying policies, like where are they based? And like I tend to see, I'd say, like I said, like 10 out of 10 people are looking at doing like full AD in Azure. Again, unless you're like kind of like a net new business.
Yeah. So, hey guys, let me try this real quick. So if you're cloud born and you're mostly just web apps or you're just web apps, you got a chance of doing Azure AD only. Or if you're cloud-born, or you have this existing Active Directory environment, you could use Azure AD Connect and replicate up to Azure AD. That way you could do the cloud stuff as well as your traditional on-prem solution. If you're cloud-born and you need that robust Windows environment, you're probably going to need Azure AD Directory Services. You could also have Azure AD Connect. And then if you're just legacy like you guys were, Ben, you're going to need full Azure AD, full AD in Azure. Very different way to say it, but more appropriately. At least for now, until you move to a world where you can slowly retire those Windows domain controller servers. Kevin, that pretty close to accurate?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I think, a couple limitations on the Azure AD domain service side that, like the ability to modify schema, et cetera, that even if you start moving everything to the cloud, like just not having, because like every app, I mean, even outside of Citrix, like consumes that domain service differently. So like being able to even like thinking like Citrix aside, there's a lot of decisions that need to be made across your application portfolio around compatibility for those cloud-based services. So I would say, like I mentioned before, if you're on-prem today and there's a lot of complexity in your app portfolio, and like even Citrix aside, like this is a pretty significant decision in terms of how you approach your domain service as you look towards Azure. So like getting back to what I mentioned before, Andy, around governance planning and like that kind of being more of part of the planning process. Citrix, we need a domain to integrate. So like you're probably looking at a full AD in Azure or an Azure AD domain service, but like the type of domain service you use is probably going to you'll want to work with all of your app partners, not just Citrix, to ensure compatibility with those services.
Well, guys, I think we've done a lot to cover this topic. Bill and Ben, any additional comments, questions you want to have with this while we got Kevin on this particular topic around identity? Very good.
No.
No, this is a conversation that comes up a lot, though.
Well, Ben, what I would tell you is, and maybe you knew Kevin before this, but Kevin's a great resource on your extended team. Obviously, there's thousands of people at Citrix you could possibly talk to, but Kevin Nardone, this question comes up. You got a rock star you can point customers to, and I'm sure to be valuable. Next section talks about management group and subscription organization. Kevin, what in the heck are we talking about here? Kevin, you're on mute. 2020.
Oh, I'm on mute. 2020. Quarter of the year. So thinking of, again, like that top level architecture, your Azure AD tenant. Within that, you have the concept of like subscriptions. So thinking of the subscription at like the highest level, it's a unit of scale. It's my my Zen server, my Citrix Zen server resource pool, or like your vCenter, and like that's kind of really the bucket where you're managing most of your Azure resources. Now, like typically today, like especially as like Azure has grown and like the scale of Azure deployments have grown, Microsoft created the concept of a management group where I can have a bundle of subscriptions all rolling up under the same management structure. So that way you can apply things like policies, role-based access control, and like overall governance and like tagging at that management group level to have it then extrapolate down into all of your buckets, your resource pools, your vCenters, et cetera, or like quote unquote, like your subscription, all into that same umbrella so you can manage it a little bit more effectively. So looking at like Citrix, especially at enterprise scale, so you're talking thousands of machines, we're starting to see like more organizations look at a management group for Citrix especially to like get what would be my bucket, my resource pool for my Citrix infrastructure. So things like your cloud connectors, file services for profiles, Azure monitoring tools, et cetera, in like a shared service subscription. And then you would have like workloads, for example, like all my VDI or like my multi-session Win10 using like the Citrix and WVD integrations, or just like your 2016, 2019 servers, you would have workloads. So you're kind of like isolating your resource pools like you would in an on-prem scenario, but now it's like using cloud governance concepts.
Yeah, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up, but Pete Downing, our CTO, he does a whole Citrix on Azure workshop, and a lot of this subscription and some of these prereqs are really a deep dive as part of these workshops. So check out XenTegra.com/events. But a lot of this you can see in firsthand real practice, and Pete does a really good job presenting this content as well. Bill, thoughts, questions on the subscription conversation here?
This is pretty consistent with what we see in most cases, particularly in the subscription organization, like I mentioned earlier, where they'll set up a separate subscription for the Citrix workloads versus production server workloads and so forth. A lot of that, to Kevin's point in this article, is driven by the threshold values in Azure, but some of it's just simply organizational separation, management separation. It's pretty common in particularly in larger organizations where we see that happening.
Yeah. And this is great for me to hear these conversations, because I've been begging people to carve out their Citrix environments away from everything else for a bunch of years, and having, partially for political reasons, just in case you hire a different team to go manage and be responsible for that. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, and like Andy, I think that's a great point too. And like thinking of like what Citrix does too, and especially like the scale of machines that you can potentially drive in like into an Azure environment, and like thinking of like resources, Microsoft's done a great job at improving things like cores per subscription, VMs per subscription. But like what people tend to think about as well is like that's like a public cloud infrastructure. Everything you're controlling, whether it be a power on, building a machine, you're hitting APIs. And those APIs are hitting against like a shared infrastructure that, is managing a whole data center, right? So like even just like the API calls you could make to like manage and throttle and set up machines, those have limits as well. And like that tends to be actually the bottleneck, especially for customers that lump in, large sets of business units into the same subscription. Hey, wait, we have 10,000 cores we can use. Like we're, only we're a pretty small shop, 500 people. But then like next thing you know, like you have 500 VDI and you're trying to like power them all on while someone's like reading and writing to a bunch of PaaS services for like the web backend that's like running your company. That's kind of where like the bottleneck really tends to show like pretty significantly is those API reads and writes, because virtual machines in Azure, those are controlled at the subscription level rather than the service principal, which is like a service account that integrates with Azure. So like that's actually one of the main reasons why we say, hey, you're managing capacity, just power on like, the user's experience when they start their desktop to like your ability for an admin to push out an emergency update and like push out a new VHD to their catalogs. Like that is impacted all by those APIs. So if you have a whole team that's just like soaking those API calls, like that's going to detriment your Citrix environment. So I would say like most cases, you want a dedicated subscription for Citrix, just like you wouldn't bundle in all of your critical infrastructure into like one single resource pool on like XenServer, mainly because it's going to, stress your hypervisor management or like one vCenter. It's like the same concept. Like you wouldn't throw all of your AD domain controllers on like the same set of servers that are running like a SAP database backend. Like that is like way too many eggs in one basket.
So Kevin, you've been working with large customers for a long time now. The real world is the SMB and commercial. They do that all the time, but you're absolutely right. They should not do that.
Yeah. And it gets into like even the SMB commercial world as well. And like it's a unit of measurement. You don't have to max it out, but it gets into like the what ifs, right? So like what if suddenly, we're so successful, we want to have everyone work from home, even like a 500 user shop, like 500 VDI, like that's still a lot of machines.
What you're really saying now though, is the cloud has made it more realistic that you can carve it off versus building out different clusters of hardware in your data centers, which is story. I mean, Ben ran a shop, 2 years ago, Ben, you were running a shop and Citrix was lumped in with everything else, not because you wanted it lumped in there. It's just because it was cost effective to buy it all and run it all on the same platform. Tell me if I'm wrong there.
No, you're correct. But I also see, and I want to ask Kevin this, these management groups could also help you with some cybersecurity, couldn't it?
Oh, Kevin's speechless. Kevin, we lose you?
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm here. Exactly, Ben. I just kind of stumbled over my words, and I think I double muted myself. But I agree with you, Ben, because one of the cool things about like the managements and the subscriptions is like Azure policy. You can actually automate things like compliance or security parameters against all the objects within that group or that subscription. And like Andy, I think you hit the nail on the head as well. And it's kind of where my like enterprise blinders sometimes like have me forget. But like from an SMB or commercial shop, like resource pools and like separating clusters like on-prem, incredibly expensive, and it tends to be cost prohibitive. But one of the cool things about Azure, like creating new subscriptions, there's no like cost associated with like creating these lines of demarcation at like a management level like they are on-prem. So like thinking about like, hey, what are some of the challenges we've run into just from like an internal IT governance within our smaller shop? Like, can we course correct that? Because now there's no cost associated with creating that line of demarcation, because I can create, 2 subscriptions, maybe one for my core shared services for my business. So like my full AD that's on Azure, maybe like a couple, like a critical like backend or like something used by HR. And then like, hey, my VDI or my virtualized applications, we're going to provision potentially 20, 30, 40, 100 VMs. Let's have that be within its own subscription so that we can kind of grow it without impacting our core set of shared services. And because you're going to have VMs provisioned, like why don't we separate the line of demarcation, one, to mitigate administrative risk, as well as, allow your business to potentially scale better, especially if you're successful.
And cost buckets.
Yep, and cost buckets, exactly. Subscriptions are also the primary area where Microsoft does billing. So doing like the lines of demarcation at the subscription level also makes like internal things like internal chargeback, or like, hey, this subscription goes to like this cost center for like finance versus security versus like the SAP team, et cetera. It also drives a lot of that as well. So like, while it does a lot with scale and like it gets into, the blog gets into like key questions, especially if you talk about like multi-subscription architectures for Citrix, where does it start to make sense to kind of have planning for a multi-subscription model rather than a single Citrix subscription model. So like I have potentially 2 or 3 Citrix buckets in a management group based on like maybe how my server and client teams are completely different groups, completely different managers. Maybe we should have all rolling into the Citrix management group subscriptions that drive, Windows 10 experiences and subscriptions that drive server-based experiences. So kind of a lot of like leading questions and things along those lines, just to kind of help teams know that, hey, I don't want to be the victim of my own success. I want to establish a process that if I ever need to have a second subscription for Citrix, like, have I planned accordingly for that within my organization?
I hear all this, and as a consultant or someone who leads a consulting practice, one, I think customers need to bring in another third party just for validation. Maybe a fourth party if you think about Citrix and another practice. At the same time, this is probably just as much an accurate statement. Just in case you get it wrong, you want that third party in there so that you have validation, documentation that good decisions, good conversations were had, and so be it. We got it wrong. Now we're going to adjust, and okay, we got someone else to blame a little bit. As much as you try to get things right, I think there's some reality in having that, having those more holistic conversations with third and fourth parties, and extremely important. What I'm getting at is don't try to make this decision all by yourself, because at that point you're the only one to blame, and chances are you're going to get it wrong.
Andy, I could see a real good play for a run book of some sort here. Like, what I'm envisioning is you go to talk to a customer and they're right on the cusp of going into this cloud journey. You kind of have a workbook with them that kind of guides them through the process, and as part of that workbook is links to things that answer, like I'm sitting here, what's the difference between a subscription, a tenant, and resource locations? And so you kind of have a little mark there that goes, here, learn about this, learn about that. And so that as you're trying to take the customer through the process, you're also giving them things that's educating them on the things they don't know. Going back to your point, you don't want to make a customer mad by asking them a bunch of questions that they're not prepared to answer. So I see a play here for, a nice workbook of some sort that would kind of guide the process and also help the sales process and the implementation process?
Yeah, we do that today with a product called Turbonomics. So we run Turbonomics and we talk the customer through what it's collecting and then what the analysis is. And it essentially then creates not necessarily a run book, but it creates a next step conversation on the data that was collected. So kind of like what you're talking about, but definitely an opportunity to gain the insight into what a tool like this can capture, and then make good decisions. And still know you might get it wrong, but it won't be because you didn't do your due diligence. So, Kevin, I think we've covered this. As you pointed out earlier in the blog, we probably could talk about a couple bullets that you had there probably for a whole blog all by themselves. But I think we're to the end here, and we're out of time for one thing. But I guess next up is your third part of this series. What are you going to cover there?
Yeah, so in the third part of the series, going from like identity and like governance, we kind of get into a little bit more of like bringing it into more of the fruition and kind of double clicking into how do I put the right components in the subscription? So like, what do I need to do to ensure my VMs are following the right business continuity and disaster recovery configurations? How can I use policy to actually drive the compliance I need from a security perspective, or even just the operational barriers you want to put just from like general human potentially error within those subscriptions as well. And then thinking of those concepts and like bringing it to like workload automation and like integrating potentially DevOps processes with machine creation services. So using the best of Azure tools and the best of Citrix tools to really drive operational efficiency is what we cover in the next blog.
Okay, great. Well, I guess we don't have to ask you what's up next because you're going to be working on that blog, and we'll be anxiously awaiting. I'll get after I get off this session, we'll get you back on the calendar. I guess we should early 2021. You'll be ready to talk about that blog, right? You'll be out and socialized.
Yep. Yeah. I'd love to talk about it. I think it's actually published at the time of this. We're setting up this podcast, so those can like check it out, and we can also dig deeper into the third. And I look forward to doing this with you all again.
Okay. Yeah, we'll put you on the next open slot here. Ben, anything before we let you go?
No, this was great, man. I learned a lot today, as usual, when I'm an attendee of these podcasts, and I always appreciate you including me in the event here. Kevin, it was good meeting you. Lots of awesome knowledge here, and just goes back to lots of books to read on the shelf. Just another one I got to get off the shelf and catch up to speed on.
Yeah, that's no hidden secret here that, it is a fact. It's not a hidden secret that part of the reason why Bill and I started this, just so we could get people like Kevin on and learn from them. And now it's applying to Ben as well. Bill, anything for you before we let you go?
I'm just curious if Kevin's read the entire 1,800-page cloud adoption framework from Microsoft.
Twice.
I would say I've read chunks of it, not the whole thing. I wish I had that time.
Kind of time, yeah. No, it's quite comprehensive for sure. It's very interesting data out there. So definitely something people should check out as they're getting into building out their cloud environments.
Kevin, you know what
aspiring Azure architect should check it out for sure.
Exactly.
Kevin, you know what RTFM stands for?
RTFM?
RTFM.
No, tell me, Andy.
So Romeo RT. So Romeo, Tango, Foxtrot, Motel.
Mike.
RTFM. So the old guys in this industry, back when the guides were small enough where you could actually read them as if they were a book.
Yeah.
They had a saying, how you were a consultant in the IT space was just RTFM, read the frickin' manual. Those days are long gone. That's why we do this podcast and write blogs.
Yeah, no, there's a lot more to it. And then unfortunately, it's not every manual covers everything, but I think that's where, like you covered before, Andy, like having a partner, especially a partner like XenTegra, where you cover not just Citrix, but also the ecosystem of end user compute between, Microsoft tools like Turbonomics to like really drive success within an organization. So like taking that manual that like me as an admin, I can like learn on my own time, but then learning from the experience of like someone within your organization. I think that's a lot, great stuff that you all bring to the table, like you mentioned before.
I had a funny conversation with someone this morning. I asked him if they had read the manual, And their response was, I don't have time to read the manual. I didn't read the manual. But what they didn't know that I knew that was their question was in the first chapter of the manual. They only had to get through the first chapter, which, to be honest, in most cases, there's a lot you get out of the first couple of chapters of, I don't want to say a manual, but a book on a topic that can set you apart from everybody else. Just okay, don't RTFM the first chapter or two. Kind of
the overview.
Son. Yeah. Read the Cliff Notes.
And I think that now too, it's also like videos on like there's just so much videos too, and like e-learning, and it's like watch the like WTFV or something. watch the video.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you all very much for having me, and looking forward to the next session.
Absolutely. Hey, Ben, Bill, thanks for joining. Kevin, we'll do it again. I'll get you on the calendar here in just a few minutes.
Perfect. Thanks, Andy. Talk to y'all soon.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you for listening to the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton. A special thanks to our guest for attending today's podcast. Podcast produced by Pete Downing. For any input, or if you'd like to be a part of our podcast, please email us at info@XenTegra.com. Please head over to XenTegra.com/podcast to listen to all podcasts in this series. This podcast is copyrighted by XenTegra LLC.